Welcome to EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. This episode of EV Hub Live brings together Atlas founder Nick Nigro, Katherine Stainken of the Electrification Coalition, and Robbie Orvis of Energy Innovation to discuss the EV elements in the recently released draft of the Inflation Reduction Act. This episode of EV Hub Live is produced by Peter Benzoni and Tom Taylor of Atlas Public Policy. Thanks for watching.
Welcome to EV Hub Live. Thanks a lot, Peter, as always. Happy Friday, everyone. It is a big day here in Washington, D.C., as we are very close to considering passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is the focus of our conversation here today. I've got two real experts on the bill with me to talk all of the ins and outs as it relates to transportation electrification. And I want to start right with Robbie. Robbie, your outfit, Energy Innovation, ran the numbers on the IRA's effects on greenhouse gas emissions. Can you give us that quick rundown? You know, this is really being billed as the biggest climate policy in U.S. history. Is that what the numbers are showing you?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And great to be here. That is definitely in line with what we're seeing. So we've been working over the past year as we had the Build Back Better Act, and then moving through all the iterations of that to try and get a handle on what the potential emissions reductions are. And in our research note released this week, we looked at the Inflation Reduction Act. And what we found is that in our baseline case, we're 24% below 2005 greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. And that's relative to a US target of 50 to 52%. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, we found the US could get to 37 to 41% below 2005 levels by 2030. So that would close about half to 2/3 of the gap in 2030 to hit that target. So what we're seeing is that this is by far the largest and most important climate legislation ever in the US, and could set the US up to achieve its targets in 2030 if coupled with strong executive and state action as well.
So it's hard to start to separate electric power and transportation in terms of emissions these days, especially as we're focusing here on electrifying transportation. But, you know, does your model look at all at being able to separate the two, and how much of these emission reductions are coming from transportation?
Yeah, so we do have that, and we've been working to kind of tease out the impact to transportation individually and some of the provisions, but don't quite have the full analysis there. We've been focused on just getting stuff out the door as quickly as possible. But from from kind of a 30,000 foot view and looking at what's in the bill, there's, a lot in there for clean electricity, especially. Obviously, we have the EV tax credits and tax credits for commercial vehicles and funding and tax credits for charging. And of course, those are helping as well. But so much of the credits and funding are targeted at the electricity sector, and they don't have some of the more delicate provisions on whether or not resources qualify. So, from a high level, we do tend to see the majority of emissions concentrated in the power sector, but we do have emissions reductions in transportation, buildings, industry, and so on.
Right on. So you mentioned the tax credit. The media has been giving some mixed coverage on the reforming of the tax credit so far. I just saw a great piece in the Wall Street Journal that came out last night. That was pretty critical of it, at least from the people quoted from the auto sector. Some are saying it's going to be a big boon, though, on the other hand, for the EV market. But, the industry themselves, they're kind of pushing back and saying that the battery and the critical mineral sourcing requirements will be really tough for them to meet, or even impossible, frankly, in the near term. Katherine, can you give us a brief outline on what's in this credit and what you think it means for the EV market?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Nick. And I'm more than happy to outline that credit because, first of all, we're in the bill, and that's just a big win in and of itself, because back in July, we were on the chopping block for sure. And so to be included in the text is a good thing, even if it's not perfect. But first, let's just kind of break it down. There were really substantive changes. So in a redline version, you can see that, first of all, it's a clean vehicle credit, not just EVs. It's a max credit of $7,500, which is kind of what it is right now. But $3,750 of that is attributed to if you meet certain requirements for critical minerals, and then $3,750 if you meet certain requirements for the battery components. There are income caps. Final assembly must be in North America. It is a long-term extension until December 31st, 2032. You could take it at the point of sale now, which is huge. That had been kind of a big issue in the past, not making it so easy for consumers to just take advantage of the credit if they didn't have tax equity. There are MSRP caps on the vehicles, and in the case of vans, SUVs, and pickup trucks, that cap is $80K. But in any other vehicle, the cap is $55K. So with the sourcing provisions, though, and this is, I think, what you wanted to get to, and what you were, referencing the Wall Street Journal article with the battery sourcing. Currently, it states that immediately, at least 50% of the value of the manufactured or assembled battery must be from North America, and then that's increasing to 100% by 2028. And certainly, I mean, we think that needs to be amended so that we would see probably maybe something like 50% starting in 2025. But there has to be kind of a longer lead time for manufacturers to be able to meet that right now. And with the minerals piece, starting immediately, what the text says now is that 50 or 40% of that value must come from, if it's 40% of the value of any extracted or processed critical mineral in the battery, it has to come from the US or a free trade agreement. And that increases 10% each year until 80% after 2026. And that is correct that could be a little challenging to meet and maybe unworkable just because it takes 3 to 5 years to build a processing plant. So we are in favor that should also be modified and that the countries that you can extract or process the minerals in should be included to include NATO and major non-NATO allies.
I was just thinking about that piece in particular, the free trade thing. We don't really have that many free trade agreements in place. So it's a pretty narrow group that we could actually do business with on this. Robbie, let's bring you into this conversation about the tax credit. What Katherine just ran through was a great overview. Is very complicated now. It was not that it was super simple before, but there are a lot more provisions than there was before. What's your take on it? Do you think this is going to be a positive thing for the EV market? Long-term, short-term, troublesome in the near term, easy in the long term? I don't know. Tell us your thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, kind of a nightmare to try and model it. I'll tell you that much.
Sure.
Spent a lot of time trying to think through the implications. I think, as both of you have mentioned, it is probably going to be really hard to hit some of those targets, especially some of the provisions around limitations on countries that can contribute any of the materials at all, countries of concern, which includes China. And so, if the processing facilities are indeed built in the US, in the long run, it could definitely be beneficial for the industry, but the timeline is really tough. I guess if there's one kind of upside, there is a lot of money in the bill and other parts of the IRA to kind of help bring those facilities into the US. But, it can be hard to build large industrial facilities in the US, and it takes time. And so, whether or not it's feasible over the time of the credit for the manufacturers to hit it, I'm not sure.
Yeah, in our last episode of EV Hub Live, we went into critical minerals, and the discussion was about if we're going to solve climate, we're going to have to extract resources, and right now our country is not very efficient at that, at least standing up these kind of projects. And so I don't know the details of the bill to the extent to which it's going to help facilitate some of that, as you mentioned, but it does seem like that's going to be a pretty big lift. And if the industry is right here, it sounds like there aren't going to be that many vehicles that actually qualify for the credit. We saw just yesterday, CBO put out the Congressional Budget Office put out their estimate of the impacts of the bill. They are not EV experts per se, but they had to make some assumptions. and the numbers were that there weren't going to be that many takers for the credit. And so, Katherine, do you want to share some thoughts on how you think this is going to impact the market? And you mentioned point of sale. We got a question on YouTube about how that's going to work logistically, because that sounds like one of the positive spins on the bill. So could you speak to a little bit about your organization's take on the impact of the credit as it is today? Because it's hard to imagine too much changing at this point. It seems like what we have is what we're going to get.
Well, I'm ever hopeful that the parliamentarian right at this very moment actually might be making some modifications, but we'll know by tonight probably. But I mean, if nothing changes, I think we're all in agreement that we do need to develop a diversified battery supply chain, because we can't just be and develop our robust, reliable supply of critical minerals, because we can't just be relying on one country and replacing dominance on reliance on oil and then with critical minerals. So there's that. And this is really forcing the issue. Now, what is this going to do in the short term with the light duty market? I mean, we know that Europe just recently, essentially, they're moving towards transportation electrification by 2035. We know that China was already a pretty booming car market, and that GM was selling more cars there annually than in the United States. And that's been consistent over the last decade. I mean, they're outpacing the new car sales. And so a lot of vehicles are going to the Chinese market, to the Asian market. Now, with the way the bill is right now, our company is going to decide to just go and build in South Korea, which already has some mineral processing capacity on the one hand, and qualifies under the current way it's written. I mean, that remains a little bit TBD. The other thing I'm curious about too, a little bit, with the automakers and their makes and models coming out. They've promised so many, I'm looking forward to those 30 plus makes and models that everyone has said that they're making. But where are they? And they made those announcements a couple of years ago. So on the one hand, if no one can take advantage of the credit for the next 2 to 3 years, and we're seeing the supply chain, be worked out in the United States and elsewhere around the world too, so that other countries are having access to minerals, and eventually then will that then eventually shift the focus back to the United States in 2 to 3 years? I think that remains a little bit to be seen.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of moving parts. Speaking of moving parts, there's one piece of the bill that is going to help lower income consumers, or really 3/4 of the vehicle market, used vehicles. Katherine, could you give us some of the details on that and what you think that's going to mean for EVs? As we've got, I think we hit about like 2 million EV sales already in the US. So we're starting to get, hundreds of thousands of them in the used market.
Yes. Yeah. The best thing about the used EV tax credit, it's that it's a 10-year extension here. And so that is phenomenal. Because to your point, Nick, we're just starting to see that turnover now. The leases are expiring after 3 years or so. And those early adopters are purchasing different makes and models. And so this is going to really expand the market up to that next tier of purchasers. So it's a tax credit of $4,000 or 30% of the sale price. Max limit is, or the sale has to be less than $25,000. There are some income caps there, but so few states have a used EV credit or a rebate. And so having this at the federal level, across the board, that's really going to help to transform the market.
Robbie, as the modeler of this crew, can you talk a little bit about what these new kind of policies mean? Did any of them that are in this bill have a meaningful impact on the emission reductions that you want to highlight in particular?
Yeah. Well, there's a few factors working against large reductions from the transportation sector policies by 2030. So one, of course, is just stock turnover. So even if we get to a large sales share of EVs, it just takes a long time for the stock to turn over. And so looking just to 2030, you kind of miss the bigger picture, which is in later years as you get the knock-on effects of all of those sales. Mm-hmm. The other limiting factor is just to the earlier conversation, how many of the vehicles will qualify. I think we, in our modeling, we have a credit value that's kind of around about 50% of the total value of both of them, kind of just hedging that, on average, it's vehicles are going to get about 3750 more or less when you combine the credits. So, and with the, historical growth of EVs, and we're kind of maxed out on the supply chains at the moment, we don't see a huge emissions impact by 2030. Looking beyond that, it grows a lot, at least from the light duty side. And so I think some of the changes Katherine mentioned could change that number. But it's not a huge part of the overall emissions reductions at the moment.
There was another piece in this bill that's quite new, and that's for commercial vehicles. Robbie, you tell us a little bit about that one. I know that's considered a bright spot, I think, in terms of vehicle incentives.
Yep. So it's another bifurcated incentive, $7,500 up to, Katherine can check me on the weight of the vehicles, maybe 14,000. 14,000. So, and then it's up to $40,000 above that. Now it is calculated as it is up to that amount based on the incremental difference between the cars. So it's basically 30% of the purchase price of the electric version minus 15% of the purchase price of the non-electric version, and then the max of 7,500 or 40,000. But that is a pretty
always keeping it simple. Always.
That's right. Yeah. Tax policy is always simple. But that's a pretty meaningful value for vehicles in those size classes. And so provided the supply of vehicles is there, that could be a pretty large impact on those segments.
Yeah, I would think so, because total cost of ownership is looking more and more favorable for these vehicles. DOE actually estimates that most vehicle classes are going to be cost competitive within the next 6-7 years without this incentive in place. So I can imagine that will be quite a good boost to that market. The extent to which, as you mentioned, a really important point, I think, about capturing emissions benefits. You're only going to buy a vehicle in 2026, 27. It's not going to get many emission benefits by 2030. And so you need a longer time horizon if you're looking at climate, which, that's what we've been doing for a long time here. Katherine, let's talk about infrastructure. We see the infrastructure money starting to flow. All the NEVI plans are into state, into US DOT and the Joint Office, and are being reviewed. So money's going to start coming out the door pretty soon. $5 billion there. Billions still coming from the utility industry, more from the private market. All that's happening. Meanwhile, speaking of complicated tax incentives,
oh my gosh,
the 30C tax credit for infrastructure has been one of the more funny incentives to me. The amount of times it's gone away and come back retroactively and whatnot. I don't hear too much about it in terms of its impact on infrastructure. Is the new run at it that's in the IRA, is that going to make a difference? Tell us more about that. And it's got a fresh coat of paint on it now. Is it now shiny and new and really attractive?
Well, first of all, we have to understand it. And I've seen a bunch of different analyses, and in full disclosure, I still have to do the red line version of it. But looking at the, just at a high level here for all the viewers out there, I mean, a 10-year extension here, like this credit will have this until December 31st, 2032. So that is huge. That's long-term certainty. You can plan out your projects. You can plan out the certain charging hubs for, larger commercial fleets. So that is huge versus, Nick, to your point about always having it retroactively. Am I going to have it? Is it extended in the tax extenders? We don't know. The other thing is that bidirectional charging equipment now also qualifies. And so as we're growing with EV adoption and having this ability for that kind of technology to qualify now and to kind of plan and do kind of future proofing, that's huge too. And so I think that that's going to really help to transform some of the charging market that we're seeing. The other pieces to this charging, the 30C credit here, the cap has been increased. The amount has technically, depending on how you want to look at it, it's either been reduced, or it's, if you meet the prevailing wage, then you get the full 30%, which it currently is. So there's that to look at. And I think that's one piece that people will be looking at about how the parliamentarian decides on that. There's also something in there about an eligible census tract. And I think that there's a little, folks are still trying to understand, is that applying to residential, commercial, or we think maybe it's both. There is a transferability aspect to that credit too. So there's a lot of pieces that still need to be kind of just tax attorneys need to sort that out. But that is going to have a bigger impact on the market now because it has that 10-year extension.
And you've mentioned parliamentarian a couple times now. Help us understand, is there things that might not end up making it because they don't qualify for reconciliation? Is that what you mean? Or tell us more about that.
Yeah, exactly. And they have been, as this text was being written for Build Back Better in the first place, all the staff were considering that this was going to have to pass through the parliamentarian. And it's kind of, there's rules about if it, under reconciliation, the rules are a little bit different than it would be if you were going through the Senate with a regular 60 vote threshold kind of thing. So because of that process there, then you can't necessarily build on and change a piece of a policy from its original intent and add too much on. That's really the date changes are fine, amounts are fine, but if you're really changing the tone or the flavor of a credit or a provision, that's kind of where maybe she's going to want to take a look at that. So the mineral provisions is one area where she might actually be taking a look at the 30D credit, and then with the 30C credit prevailing wage, I think she'll probably take a look at that too.
Robbie, anything you want to add on the sausage making? Because I have another question for you that's more bigger picture.
No, it's happening today. The bird bath is the process where the parliamentarian reviews it and hears arguments from both sides and makes a call on what's in and what's out. Pretty wild way to make policy. But so I think, to Katherine's points, we may know potentially within a few hours kind of if anything needs to change and how it might change. I do think a lot of the tax credits had gone through the parliamentarian previously, but some of the ones we're talking about now, like the EV tax credits, changed a lot. And so there's big questions around whether or not it'll make it.
So on this infrastructure credit, we mentioned it's on and off again, hard to really predict whether it's going to be around, at least in the past. Now with this certainty, help us understand big picture, Robbie. How much does this matter for EV adoption? Clearly it can matter for infrastructure if you're getting a huge discount on the stations or the equipment or the installation. But what about the adoption of EVs? Like, how does that factor into your analyses and what you all consider when you're looking at the big picture here?
Yeah. So another tough thing to model, and I know different groups handle it differently. What we do is we use some research from the National Renewable Energy Lab that looked at kind of how much kind of perceived cost do consumers have from things like charger availability or range anxiety, which are related. And then in our model, we basically look at the charger density relative to, say, gasoline pumps, and that helps bring down the cost of the perceived cost of those limitations. So, the infrastructure bill in the summer last year did a lot on that front. And so here again, we're seeing kind of additional decreases in kind of the consumer perceived costs, if you will, of EVs that result from charging infrastructure. So, from my view, the charging piece is critical. Can't get to high adoption of EVs without it. But just having the charger, you could build 1 trillion chargers you want. If people don't want to buy EVs, they're not going to buy them. So we need both. Can't have one without the other. And so I'm happy to see there's more on chargers and infrastructure now. But I think the jury's out still on the kind of the demand side, kind of driven from the EV tax credit.
We got a question, building off this stuff a little bit more. We got a question from our audience here. This one may be for you first, Katherine. One of the things that's different about the tax credit for charging infrastructure is there's much higher. There's also some confusing language for me, at least, about whether it's site-based or equipment-based. But it's up to $100,000 now instead of a much lower number. So that makes me think, this is now targeted at much bigger infrastructure projects. Do you think this is going to have that meaningful impact if it's targeted at these bigger projects that cost a few $1 million or whatever? Do you think that this credit's going to help push those projects along or bring them in? Or what do you think the effects are going to be of these newer infrastructure projects that are starting to happen?
Yeah, I think that you just pretty much hit the nail on the head, Nick, there, that it's the credit, the modifications now, like it's applied to kind of each property versus the project as a whole. And so you can go bigger and bolder. And I think that aligns then with the vision that the Biden administration has right now for building out the charging stations along the highway. So
right on. Robbie, anything you want to add there?
Nope. I think that's a good summary.
So we got another question. It's like a lot of very busy YouTube audience today. This one's gonna pretty quick for you, Katherine. I think, how's this gonna work for people? There is an AGI cap, adjusted gross income cap now on things. Are people gonna have to go in with their 1040s and say, here, dealer, like, here's how much I made, give me my credit?
Yeah, that's why some of these changes to the 30D credit are not super, because the more stipulations you have on a credit, it's making it harder for the consumer to take advantage of it. And we know if anyone has, lots of different requirements on a rebate program, it's California. And data shows that right? There's, I mean, they've made changes with, trying to stretch out that funding further to their credit. So that's good. But they've had to put in various MSRP caps. They've considered one per person. That's California. And this is definitely, these changes are going to affect the consumer understanding how to take advantage of this. I think the question there was on the dealership and some training that is probably going to have to happen with a lot of the dealers. Can you bring that up again? Yeah. Will the dealership be verifying your income? I mean, that's going to have to, it depends. I think if you're claiming the credit yourself, or if you're going to want it at the, if you're claiming it yourself, I believe the way it's reading is that then no, you can just apply, when you file your taxes, you'll get it that way. But for most people, I would imagine they're going to want it up front at this point of sale. And then, so yes, I don't see a way that
that's
you can get around
really
it.
Interesting point, right? If you just going to want to put it on your tax form, which a lot of people will, you don't really have to prove AGI because it's all after the fact. I mean, you certainly prove it to the IRS, but you're already kind of doing that.
Yeah.
Robbie, can you tell us a little bit about big picture about these stipulations that they're putting into these tax incentives? Like, how should we be thinking about this? From system-wide impact here.
So this is the transferability element, right? So you don't have just a cash on the hood rebate, but you can transfer your rebate, assuming you qualify. And I think it's a good question how you'll demonstrate that. I mean, a lot of people who finance their cars would have a credit check anyway, so maybe they can get rolled into that. But so there's kind of, you would transfer the rebate or the tax credit rather to the dealer, who would then put it on as kind of the purchase price reduction. I think I know that as far as we're concerned, and some of the other modelers we've been talking to, we're going to assume there's at least kind of like a 5 to 10% hit to the rebate. Again, tax credit, the dealer's going to take some of that. But it does kind of mean you don't have to wait till the next tax filing year. We have basically just been assuming that there's that transferability penalty, we're calling it, a 5 to 10%. And that's kind of all we've been doing, because otherwise it seems fairly straightforward to kind of just transfer it and get it off the price of the vehicle.
This is another good question from the audience that really helps frame what's actually happening. Today, a large number of vehicles that are sold, EVs, are not eligible for the credit because they're built by an OEM that no longer has the credit. GM, Tesla, Toyota, soon Ford, soon Nissan, etc. So that list was growing. But on the other hand, you've got new entrants and other OEMs who haven't come close to the 200,000 cap, where they had credits available to them. We look ahead and look at what does this mean in the future. Certainly the folks who had credits expired, they might become eligible again, but they might not, per you all's analysis. Is this going to be a net loss in terms of the number of vehicles that are actually going to have an incentive, or is it a net gain? Or is it going to change as time goes on? Does anybody want to try to make a prediction on that? Or can anybody say how many vehicles they think actually today would even qualify?
I mean, thanks for the question, Mark. Mr. Geller. That's a really tough one. And I know that there's a lot of analysis going on right now for this. And so to say that, we're going to see X million more or X 100,000 fewer. We can't say that. But overall, I mean, I think that the way that the battery component piece at least was written is certainly easier to meet than the minerals piece. And so that's a 3750 credit, which is not nothing. You know, that's pretty substantive. And I think that within a year or two, maybe even sooner, I have heard that some automakers can actually comply with that piece right now. But that's certainly a little bit more achievable. And so 3750 versus then for some consumers that would have had, to your point, Nick, no credit if you're GM, if you're Tesla, et cetera. And, you know, I think you'd see more adoption under those automakers with having that 3750 credit than having nothing. So I would also say, you know, Robbie, you made a point about the production tax credit for manufacturers there and what that's going to do for the mineral supply chain and just manufacturing, bringing that into the United States. There are a lot of moving pieces to this whole conversation. Like, it's not just the 30D credit. There's, you know, the production tax credit. There's things that were in the bipartisan infrastructure law to help with minerals processing and the supply chain aspect. There's things that were even under the Trump administration, they started some funding to look at where the minerals even are in the United States. And so I think it's a little short-sighted just to focus in on the 30D credit specifically, but we have to look a little bit bigger and take it as a circle or two further to see how really the EV market is changing and what the 30D credit means.
Yeah, we haven't really had, you know, one thing I've been saying is it's like kind of industrial policy masquerading as climate and energy policy a little bit. We haven't really had this magnitude of industrial policy around kind of clean technology. And so I think it's just really hard. It's a great question because it's so hard to give an answer. I think to Katherine's point, I would just also say, we don't see the domestic battery assembly as a real constraint. We actually think that will be fine. And the AGI cap is probably a more important constraint for that half of the incentive, but the minerals piece is really where the challenge is.
Yeah, I like your comment about this being industrial policy. That does sound very much like the language of Senator Manchin and what his aims are with this legislation in terms of wanting to build these vehicles in the United States and insource more, of facets of the supply chain and pieces of the supply chain. So I know we're waiting for some parliamentarian judgment on different little pieces of the bill. Tomorrow's a big day here on Capitol Hill. What's next, guys? What should we be paying attention to besides the watching C-SPAN this weekend? Katherine.
I mean, I'll go ahead, Katherine.
Okay. Well, I mean, yes, watch C-SPAN. Well, first of all, big news that I can't remember now when I read this, but Senator Sinema is on board with this. And so that's why, first of all, they're able to move forward. And so tomorrow, right, they will take a motion to proceed on the reconciliation bill. There'll be a series of amendments. There's limited time for that. Obviously, the Republicans will have a plethora of amendments there to consider. It's unclear what the Democratic amendments will look like. There's been some news about that Bernie Sanders might offer some, and maybe there might be one or two on some other issues. But for the most part, we'll move through the amendment process there. I doubt kind of that some of the Republican ones would be taken up, but you never know. And then they'll be voting on Monday or Tuesday, and then likely the House will come back, and then we could have a law by Wednesday. And then I imagine that the president would sign it pretty quickly. And so, yeah, the next 7 days are super transformational for our electric vehicle policy here, our climate policy. So, it's really exciting. And then after that, I mean, let's just, I'll say positive here, assuming we get the bill, I mean, then we're just going to keep this momentum going. It's kind of like the United States then kind of took an energy drink, and we have to keep that like jolt of energy going. And that's a whole nother podcast, Nick, all the things that are coming up in the next 4 months, even to continue to spur this momentum. Yeah.
Robbie.
I mean, that's all dead on. I don't have too much more to add. I think, the next week, I'm ready to get off the roller coaster of reconciliation. I'll say it's been a year-long roller coaster. So I'm hoping we arrive at our destination. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to see to seeing what the parliamentarian comes up with today, and hopefully to seeing this go across the finish line in the next week.
You know, there's a lot of complaining about Washington these days for a variety of reasons. But if this piece of legislation becomes law, this is going to be a very, very productive Congress, as it were. And so, yeah, I take all of your points here. It's going to be a very exciting week. Hopefully everything will get done before I'm supposed to go on vacation next Friday, because I really don't want to watch C-SPAN on my vacation, but we'll see. So that brings us to a close here for this episode of EV Hub Live. I just want to thank my guests, Robbie and Katherine. Really great discussion about the IRA. Feels like they could have come up with a better acronym for that one, but it is what it is, and so we'll take it. So stay tuned for the next episode of EV Hub Live. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye now.
Thanks.
Bye.